Hello. I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of this land. The Mosman Parks and Bushland Association, in caring for parks and bushland, is carrying on the legacy of our first carers for country. And next, I would like to thank Donna Bray, Mosman's local studies librarian. These talks were her idea to spread the word about local groups to the wider community. Thank you, Donna. So I'm Kate Eccles, and I'm the current president of Mosman Parks and Bushland. So, what is Mosman Parks and Bushland, and what do we do? We preserve and protect the bushland, parks, and open space of Mosman. How do we do it? We're an advocacy group and a bush regeneration group. They go together and have done so right from the very beginning. So, a little history. A road was bulldozed across a park, and that was the origin of our advocacy. In February 1964, a Mosman resident on her way home on the ferry couldn't believe her eyes when she saw a bulldozer tearing into the bush on Bradley's Head, preparing to build a road. Other residents were similarly shocked, including some council members. It wasn't the council building the road, it was a trust related to the zoo. Anyway, there was a big fuss, meetings, shirt-fronting politicians, politely back in 1964. And Mosman Parks and Bushland began. It had a different name for a few years, but that's too long a story for now. The aim was to preserve the parkland for public recreation and enjoyment, with as much bushland as possible. At the same time, the idea of bush regeneration was being born. Among the founding members of the association were two remarkable women, Joan and Eileen Bradley. Joan and Eileen were sisters who lived in Iluka Road, Mosman. No relation, by the way, of the Lieutenant William Bradley, after whom Bradley's Head is named. But they had been observing the bushland near Iluka Road, now in the Sydney Harbour National Park. They had been noting the encroachment of weeds there and doing bird surveys, particularly grieving at the decline in the number of small birds. Joan had a Bachelor of Science and Eileen had an arts degree. Joan's science degree allowed her to be taken seriously enough to get some action on the weeds. But what the sisters observed was that the action wasn't working. This is what Joan wrote to a friend. In 1964, the council hacked away, burned and uprooted the weeds in the parkland, but of course it grew back into lantana practically overnight. But we began to pull away the weeds in good bush, and we could see that the bush was beginning to help itself. The native plants were beginning to grow back by themselves. The bush was regenerating on its own. And this was the origin of their method of bush regeneration, now known as the Bradley method. This little book, Bush Regeneration, was published by the Mosman Parks and Bushland Association. This book, Bringing Back the Bush, is still used as a handbook today and was recently reprinted. The method is really simple. Work from good areas of bush to the bad weed-infested areas. Disturb the soil as little as possible so that the seeds can germinate on their own. And 3, allow the regeneration to dictate the rate of clearing. In other words, don't do more than you can keep under control. So simple, but so new at the time. It's now applied widely here and overseas too. the sisters and their friends began applying their principles around Mosman. Their friends included the mayor of Mosman, Barry O'Keefe, who, the story goes, would sing funeral dirges in Latin to lift their spirits while working. Another of their friends, Audrey Lenning, was my mentor, and she told the story of how they chose the words bush regenerator, or bush regeneration. So, we started off on Saturday mornings weeding. During a break, discussion came around to our sign, which read, "Weeders at Work." Weeding didn't seem to express the positive nature of what we were doing. So ideas and words were tossed around, and finally someone said, "regenerator," which was unanimously accepted. The sign was now to read, "Bush Regenerators at Work." The sign writer made a mistake and wrote regenerators, leaving out an EN. It wasn't till several months later that a 7-year-old asked, "What does regerator mean?" Bush care is a term often used to describe caring for the bush, but I prefer bush regeneration, partly because of our history, but also because it seems to me that it expresses the ideal behind what we do. We pull out weeds, plants that are foreign to the area, and then we wait to see what the bush will provide by itself. And we hope it will be a native. It isn't always. So saving public land and the conservation of bushland have continued to be intertwined in the history of Mosman Parks and Bushland. You see, if a piece of land is covered in lantana and weeds, it can be dismissed as just a piece of worthless land, and who would want it preserved? The battle for Kelly's Bush over in Hunters Hill in the 70s is just such an example. A group of housewives gained the support of Jack Mundy and the Builders Federation Union to conserve land at Hunters Hill. The union placed a green ban on the proposed development, and eventually the land was saved. Our association, including Joan Bradley, weighed in with support, at the time introducing bush regeneration to the battlers too. Over the years, Mosman Parks and Bushland has mainly been concerned with Mosman, and I think we can say that the role we've played in preserving Mosman's character and landscape has been significant. There have been successes and losses, but the successes have outweighed the losses. I'm mentioning just a few. There was the battle for the Bathers' Pavilion, which kept it open to the public and saved public land. There was the battle for the Harbour Trust land. The Headland Preservation Group, led by Linda Bergen and Don Goodsir, spearheaded that campaign, along with Phil Jenkin and the Defenders of Sydney Harbour. But Mosman Parks and Bushland was right in there too. There was a 20-year war for Waiarjan Reserve, culminating in a land and environment case which saved land eventually for Waiarjan Reserve. So, what do we get up to now? Well, we're very lucky in having a local council that recognises the value of our parks and bushland, and a community that votes for those councillors. It was not always thus. Once upon a time, there was a mayor of Mosman who said, if people wanted trees, they should go and live in the mountains. Times have changed. Usually, but not always, we and council see eye to eye, and we are supporting them rather than battling. We review council's plans and policies as they're made or updated and add our comments. The policy for unmade roads was a recent one. But looking through my list, I noted comments on the nature strip policy, the urban forest policy, Moss Plan, and various plans of management for parks, to name but a few. Council amalgamations. Remember them? We were fully behind Council in its struggle against amalgamations. We were out there giving talks and attending rallies. We were very determined that our independent, unamalgamated Council would hear us more clearly than distant headquarters in Manly or Chatswood. The scenic protection area was another recent one. We wanted to make sure that the view of Mosman from the harbour continued to be covered in trees and not covered in concrete. Joel's Reserve. We were invited by the then mayor to work with residents and council to diffuse the confrontation that had developed. Usually, but not always. Sometimes, council needs persuasion. Harnett Park is a tiny little green patch on Mosman Bay and was a development application to cover half of that green space with kayak sheds. Kayaking is an excellent recreation, but the loss of that green space to a building had to be opposed. The sheds were refused in the end, and the space was saved. A win for the harbour and the public. Middlehead Oval and synthetic turf. We know so much about the awful effect of plastics on the environment. We had to oppose that one. We joined forces with the Headland Preservation Group and prevailed. And Mosman Council is now taking excellent care of the natural turf on that oval. Our advocacy isn't restricted to Mosman Council. We take on the state and federal issues too, because of course state and federal level policies affect us locally. For instance, the state biodiversity legislation is dreadful. Those new laws allow a shocking amount of unnecessary land clearing. Land clearing diminishes our flora and means loss of habitat diminishes our flora and means loss of habitat for our fauna. Think of our koalas, extinct in New South Wales by 2050. And the 1050 Code of Vegetation Clearing. We lost 80 trees in Mosman, over 80 trees, and none of them were because of bushfire risk. At the federal level, we urged that the Sydney Harbour Federation Trust and its nationally important lands, including our own Middlehead, Georges Head, and Chowder Bay, should remain in federal hands. And we also urged that the Act of Parliament protects them should be continued, and for funding, so that the Trust can do its job without resorting to over-commercialisation. Our members responded valiantly with letters and submissions, and how pleased we were at the result. The lands remained federal. The EPBC Act is another one, Environment Protection and Biodiversity Act. We shall be advocating for better legal protections and for an independent regulator. And last on my list, climate change, which of course is without question the most important issue. We are so proud that our own elected MP, Zali Steggall, has initiated a climate change bill that is both reasonable and possible. Our submission to the parliamentary inquiry into the bill was one of the most recent we've done. Can you believe that our iconic platypus will shortly be on the list of vulnerable species due to climate change and loss of habitat? So that brings us back to Mosman and saving our own trees. And that brings us back to our current bush regeneration activities. You'll recall that I began saying that we're an advocacy group and a bush regeneration group. They both have their roles in protecting and preserving parks and bushland. Mosman Parks and Bushland coordinates several groups: the Bradley Bushland Reserve, Waiargin, and the Sydney Harbour National Park, and many of our members work in other reserves as well. We also have a nesting box project, which the state government, our member for North Shore, Felicity Wilson, got that for us. And here we are, having a great time. Oh, this was the Rawson Slopes project, actually. The slopes below Rawson Oval. Encouraged by Warringah MP Zali Steggall's office, we encouraged Mosman Council to apply for that grant. And Hugh Wiley from Mosman Council had the bright idea of fixing up the horrible slopes. Council did the landscaping, and then we had the fun planting the plants. Here we are, having a great time in the midst of COVID. And last year, Zali and the Mayor, Carolyn Corrigan, came for morning tea and an inspection. Sometimes there are one-off activities. The Aboriginal Girls' Hostel, the Biala project, was one. The Veggie Garden at Mosman Public School was another. The headmaster lent a hand as well. So that's what we do. What can we do for you? You can become a bush regenerator. You can give up your gym membership, and you can enjoy a sense of community and work very hard at making new friends. But if you're better with a pen than a trowel, there will be lots of opportunities to write letters. Or if you're good at advocacy, there will be opportunities to attend council or panel meetings. Or if you're better on your feet with a placard, there are sure to be opportunities to support and annoy politicians. Last but not least, what can you do for us? Well, you could join our email list, and you could join the association, a modest fee, and we'd love some fresh faces. You could spread the word about saving parks and bushland. It all helps. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. We do have a couple of questions for you.
Okay.
Anne asks if you can explain the relationship between the Friends of Bradley's Bushland and Mosman Parks and Bushland Association.
The Bradley Parks and the Friends of Bradley Bushland, they wound up a few years ago and we took over their operation. But they had an interesting little history of their own because they worked in the area of the Bradley Bushland where, just beside the tennis courts particularly, and Barry O'Keefe, once again, was hard at it. He got a federal grant. The tennis courts there was a rumour they were going to expand. So Barry O'Keefe got the bright idea that he would doubly protect this land by getting a grant for a wildflower walk. And that's what the Friends of Bradley Bushland looked after. We've taken over their role now. We work in the bushland as a whole.
Thank you. And the second question is from Rosie. She would like to know, do you need any pre-knowledge or skill to become a volunteer bush regenerator?
Absolutely not. No, you don't. You learn about weeds while you're doing it, while you're on the job. Often we give you a particular weed to deal with to start with, and after you've done that weed for a few hours, I can tell you that you don't forget it. I remember one of our bush regenerators in the national park saying to me, rolling her eyes, "I will never forget ribbonweed." So no, you don't need any special skills. You learn it.
And how often does the bush regeneration groups meet?
Different times for different groups. Waiargin meets twice a month for 4 hours at Bradley's Head, Bradley Bushland. We meet 4 times a month for 2 hours on each one, is that right? And in the national parks, we do a mere 3 hours a month, and we have a great time there.
Thank you for that. That was fantastic.
Thank you.